In October 1915, Ernest Shackleton watched his ship Endurance being slowly crushed by Antarctic ice, taking with it all their supplies, shelter, and hope of rescue. 28 men stood on the ice, 200 miles from civilization, with 3 small lifeboats and limited food. Every previous Antarctic expedition that had faced similar disasters ended in death. Shackleton's ended with every single man rescued alive. This is the story of the greatest survival expedition in history, where failure became triumph through sheer leadership and determination. The Endurance left South Georgia Island on December 5, 1914, heading for Antarctica with a crew of 28 men and 1 mission, crossed the Antarctic continent on foot, something no human had ever accomplished. Ernest Shackleton, the expedition leader, had already come within 97 miles of the South Pole in a previous expedition. This time he wanted to go farther, traverse the entire continent. The timing was terrible. World War I had just begun in Europe. Shackleton offered to cancel the expedition and put his men and ship at Britain's disposal. The British Admiralty sent a one-word reply: proceed. So they did. Shackleton was 40 years old, an experienced polar explorer, with a reputation for bringing his men back alive. This mattered more than reaching goals, he believed. Success meant everyone surviving, not planting flags. The crew he assembled reflected this philosophy. They weren't just the most qualified applicants, they were men Shackleton believed could handle psychological stress as much as physical hardship. When selecting the team, Shackleton reportedly asked questions like, "Are you good-tempered?" and "Can you sing?" These seemed frivolous but revealed Shackleton's understanding that months of isolation and hardship would test morale more than physical ability. Among the crew were Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command, who'd been on previous Antarctic expeditions and was unflappable under pressure. Frank Worsley, the ship's captain, who possessed almost supernatural navigation skills. Tom Crean, an Irish sailor who'd survived Scott's previous Antarctic expedition and was tough as nails. Leonard Hussey, who brought a banjo, which Shackleton insisted on because music would be vital for morale. Also aboard was photographer Frank Hurley, whose cameras would document the expedition. Hurley's photographs would later become some of the most iconic images in exploration history, particularly the images of Endurance trapped and dying in the ice. The Endurance entered the Weddell Sea in December 1914, pushing south through increasingly thick pack ice. This wasn't unusual. Antarctic ice was always difficult to navigate. But the ice in the Weddell Sea in early 1915 was worse than anyone had seen. The summer temperatures had been unusually cold, and ice that should have melted remained thick and solid. By January 18, 1915, Endurance was completely trapped in pack ice, frozen solid and unable to move. The ship was only 85 miles from the Antarctic coast, tantalizingly close to their landing objective. But those 85 miles might as well have been 1,000. The ice had them. Shackleton's first decision demonstrated his leadership. Instead of panicking or raging against fate, he calmly assessed the situation and adapted. They couldn't reach Antarctica now. Fine. They'd winter on the ship, frozen in the ice, and wait for spring thaw to free them. It would delay the expedition by months, but wasn't fatal to the mission. The crew settled into shipboard routine. They established sleeping schedules, mealtimes, and work assignments. They played football on the ice. They held sing-alongs with Hussey's banjo. They celebrated birthdays and holidays. Shackleton insisted on maintaining normalcy and morale. But the ice wasn't done with them. Throughout 1915, the pack ice drifted north, carrying the frozen Endurance with it. This was actually good news. They were moving toward open water, where the ice would eventually melt and release them. But the ice pressure was increasing. Massive ice floes, driven by wind and currents, pressed against each other with unimaginable force. Endurance was caught between these grinding forces. The ship's timbers began to groan and crack. In October 1915, the pressure became too much. The ice started crushing Endurance like a hand squeezing an egg. The crew heard the ship dying, wood splintering, metal buckling, the hull breaching as ice forced its way inside. On October 27, 1915, Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. The crew moved all supplies they could carry onto the ice: food, tents, 3 lifeboats, navigational equipment, and crucially, Hurley's photographic plates. He was allowed to save only 120 plates. The rest had to be smashed to prevent him from risking his life returning for them later. For weeks they camped on the ice next to Endurance, watching the ship slowly die. On November 21, 1915, Endurance finally sank beneath the ice, taking with it any hope of sailing to civilization. 28 men stood on unstable pack ice, 200 miles from the nearest permanent human settlement, with no ship and no way to communicate with the outside world. They had 3 wooden lifeboats, limited food supplies, tents, and the clothes on their backs. By any rational assessment, they were dead men. Previous Antarctic expeditions faced with similar disasters had ended with most or all crew members dying. The odds of everyone surviving were basically zero. Shackleton gathered his men and told them the situation plainly. "Ship and stores have gone, so now we'll go home." Just like that. No despair, no blame, no surrender to fate. They'd lost the ship, so they'd find another way home. Simple. This matter-of-fact determination set the tone for everything that followed. They weren't victims of misfortune. They were men facing a problem that required solving. The problem happened to be getting 28 men across hundreds of miles of Antarctic ocean to civilization without a proper ship, but it was still just a problem. Shackleton's plan was to march across the ice toward Paulet Island, about 346 miles northwest, where an old emergency cache of supplies had been left by a previous expedition. They hauled the boats and supplies on sledges, man-hauling everything because the sled dogs couldn't pull enough weight on the rough ice. The march was hell. The ice was a chaotic landscape of pressure ridges, ice blocks, and slushy sections that could give way without warning. They made perhaps a mile per day on average, exhausting themselves for minimal progress. After a week, they'd covered only 7.5 miles. Shackleton called a halt. At this rate, they'd die of exhaustion before reaching Paulet Island. They'd camp on the ice and drift with the pack, hoping currents would carry them toward open water or land. It was giving up control but preserving strength. They established Patience Camp on the ice and settled in to wait. For 4 months, from November 1915 to April 1916, they camped on a drifting ice floe, slowly moving north as ocean currents carried them. They were drifting away from Paulet Island, but toward open water, both good news and terrifying. Good news: once they reached open water, they could launch the boats and sail to land. Terrifying: the ice beneath them was slowly melting. Their platform was shrinking, becoming unstable. Eventually, it would disintegrate entirely, dumping them into the Antarctic Ocean. During these months, Shackleton's leadership was tested in ways no management textbook covers. He had to keep 28 men psychologically intact while living on melting ice in one of the harshest environments on Earth, knowing rescue was impossible and survival uncertain. He did this through small actions, ensuring everyone got equal rations, rotating duties so no one felt exploited, encouraging social activities and conversation, and most importantly, projecting absolute confidence that they'd survive. Even when he privately doubted, Shackleton never showed it to the crew. Food was a constant concern. They'd salvaged supplies from Endurance, but not enough to last indefinitely. They hunted seals and penguins on the ice, and the dogs they'd brought for the expedition, heartbreakingly, had to be killed for food. Shackleton made the dog shootings quick and ensured the men who'd bonded with the dogs weren't the ones who had to do it. By April 1916, the ice floe had drifted far enough north to reach the edge of the pack ice. Open water appeared, but their platform was disintegrating. On April 9, 1916, the ice floe they'd camped on for months split in two during the night. Men woke to find water where their tent had been. It was time to leave. They launched the 3 lifeboats, James Caird, Dudley Docker, and Stancomb Wills, and loaded 28 men into boats designed for perhaps 20 total. They were overcrowded, unstable, and heading into the worst ocean on Earth, the Drake Passage, where Antarctic and Atlantic waters meet in perpetual storms. For 5 days they sailed and rowed through the Southern Ocean, sleeping in shifts in the overcrowded boats, constantly bailing water, exposed to freezing spray and wind. Men suffered from frostbite, salt sores and dehydration, surrounded by water but unable to drink it. They couldn't light fires, they couldn't properly dry out. Everything was wet, cold and miserable. On April 15, 1916, they spotted land, Elephant Island, a desolate rock at the edge of the Antarctic peninsula. It wasn't inhabited and was rarely visited, but it was solid ground. After 497 days living on ice and ocean, they'd reached land. The crew staggered onto the beach, some kissing the rocky ground. They'd survived the sinking of their ship, 4 months drifting on ice, and 5 days in open boats through Antarctic waters. Any other expedition would have called this a miracle and waited for rescue. Shackleton knew better. Nobody knew they were on Elephant Island. Nobody would think to look there. They could die on this beach waiting for rescue that would never come. He announced his plan. He would take 5 men in the largest lifeboat, the 22-foot James Caird, and sail 800 miles across the Drake Passage to South Georgia Island, where there was a whaling station with ships and radio. They'd get help and return for the others. 800 miles in a 22-foot open boat through the worst ocean on Earth. The Drake Passage was legendary among sailors as the most dangerous water in the world. Waves reached 40 feet high. Winds exceeded 50 mph regularly. Ships had been lost there. A small lifeboat attempting the crossing was essentially suicide. Shackleton selected his crew for the James Caird carefully. Captain Worsley for his navigation skills, Tom Crean for his toughness, carpenter Harry McNish to maintain the boat, and 2 others, Tim McCarthy and John Vincent. 6 men total. They modified the James Caird, adding a makeshift deck cover to prevent swamping and gathering what supplies they could salvage. On April 24, 1916, they launched the James Caird into the Drake Passage, while the remaining 22 men watched from Elephant Island. The crossing took 17 days. 17 days in a 22-foot boat being tossed by waves that should have sunk them, soaked constantly by freezing spray, sleeping in wet sleeping bags in the cramped space beneath the deck, navigating by sextant when the sun occasionally appeared through storm clouds. Worsley's navigation was masterful. He had to calculate their position using brief sun sightings from a pitching deck in a boat that was moving unpredictably. Error margins on these calculations were huge. Miss South Georgia, only a few miles wide, and they'd sail past into the Atlantic with no way to sail back against prevailing winds. On May 8, 1916, they spotted South Georgia's mountains through storm clouds. They'd hit the island, but they made landfall on the wrong side, the uninhabited south coast. The whaling stations were on the north coast, separated by South Georgia's mountainous interior. Too exhausted to sail around the island, which would take days and risk more storms, Shackleton made an insane decision. They'd walk across South Georgia's interior. This had never been done. The island's interior was unmapped mountains, glaciers and crevasses. But Shackleton, Worsley and Crean did it anyway. They walked for 36 hours straight, climbing mountains and crossing glaciers in the dark with minimal equipment. At one point they slid down an ice slope seated in a row because climbing down would take too long. It was reckless and desperate, and it worked. On May 20th, 1916, 3 filthy, exhausted men walked into the Stromness whaling station on South Georgia. Workers didn't recognize them at first. These couldn't be the clean-cut explorers who'd left 2 years earlier. But when Shackleton identified himself, the station manager was shocked. "The Endurance was lost," he said. "We thought you were all dead." "Not dead," Shackleton replied. "But we need to rescue 22 men on Elephant Island immediately." The rescue proved complicated. Antarctic winter was setting in. Pack ice made Elephant Island difficult to approach. Shackleton's first 3 rescue attempts in different ships were turned back by ice. On the fourth attempt in August 1916, they broke through. After 105 days stranded on Elephant Island, the 22 men saw a ship approaching. Shackleton stood on the deck counting heads as the boat approached the beach. 22 men, all alive, everyone accounted for. "Are you all well?" Shackleton shouted. "All well," came the reply. Later, someone asked Shackleton what he'd have done if someone had died during those 105 days waiting for rescue. "I don't know," he admitted. "I couldn't bear to think about it." The Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition was a complete failure as an expedition. They never set foot on the Antarctic continent. They never attempted the crossing. The expedition accomplished none of its stated objectives, but it became the greatest survival story in exploration history. 28 men endured ship destruction, months on drifting ice, an open boat journey through Antarctic waters, and isolation on Elephant Island. All 28 survived. This was unprecedented. Previous polar expeditions regularly lost men to exposure, starvation, disease, or accidents. Scott's Antarctic expedition lost 5 men, including Scott himself. Franklin's Arctic expedition lost all 129 men. But Shackleton brought everyone home. How? Leadership is the simple answer, but that doesn't capture what Shackleton actually did. He maintained morale through small actions, equal rations, rotating unpleasant duties, encouraging singing and games, never showing his own doubts. He made hard decisions quickly, abandoning the ship, stopping the march to Paulet Island, attempting the James Caird crossing. He led by example, sleeping in the same conditions as his men, working as hard as anyone, taking risks personally rather than sending others. Most importantly, Shackleton understood that in survival situations, psychology matters more than physical ability. A crew that stays united and motivated can survive conditions that would kill a demoralized group. He kept his men believing they'd survive, and that belief sustained them through circumstances that should have killed them. Modern business schools study Shackleton's leadership. His decision-making, crisis management, and team building are taught as models. But reducing his leadership to management principles misses something essential. Shackleton genuinely cared about his men. This wasn't technique, it was character. When offered the chance to escape Elephant Island with the rescue ship's crew and send a different captain back for his remaining men, Shackleton refused. He'd abandoned them once to seek rescue. He wouldn't do it again. He led every rescue attempt personally until they succeeded. The photographs Frank Hurley saved document the expedition visually. Images of endurance trapped in ice, the crew camped on ice floes, and the launching of the James Caird have become iconic. But photographs can't capture the psychological weight, the knowledge that rescue was impossible, the daily grind of surviving on melting ice, the terror of the Drake Passage crossing. Several expedition members wrote memoirs afterward. All credited Shackleton with their survival. None blamed him for the ship's loss. They understood the ice that trapped endurance was unpredictable. What they remembered was his leadership during the crisis. Frank Wild, who commanded the men left on Elephant Island during Shackleton's rescue attempt, maintained discipline and morale for 105 days, partly by imitating Shackleton's leadership style. Every morning, Wild would announce, "Get your things ready, boys. The boss may come today." This ritual kept hope alive even as weeks stretched into months. Shackleton died in 1922 during another Antarctic expedition, suffering a heart attack at age 47. He was buried on South Georgia Island at his wife's request. She felt he belonged there, in the Antarctic he'd loved and explored. His grave overlooks the sea, within sight of the mountains he'd crossed during his desperate trek to the whaling station. It's fitting. Shackleton belonged to the ice and cold, to impossible situations that required extraordinary leadership. The Endurance itself remained lost for over a century. In 2022, a deep-sea exploration team found the wreck sitting upright on the ocean floor, remarkably well preserved in the cold Antarctic water. The ship that had carried 28 men into disaster and forced them into the greatest survival story ever told finally revealed itself, still bearing the name that had proven both ironic and prophetic. Endurance, the quality Shackleton's crew needed to survive, the quality he exemplified, the quality that brought 28 men through conditions that should have killed them all. The expedition's failure paradoxically became its triumph. They failed to cross Antarctica, but succeeded in something more important, proving that leadership, determination, and teamwork could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Every person who studies leadership, survival, or human psychology learns about Shackleton. Not because he conquered Antarctica, he didn't, but because he understood something fundamental. Success isn't always reaching your goal. Sometimes success is bringing everyone home alive. 28 men sailed into Antarctic waters in 1914. 28 men returned to civilization in 1916. In the annals of polar exploration, that 100% survival rate is unique. It represents leadership at its finest and human resilience at its strongest. The Imperial Trans-Antarctic expedition achieved nothing it set out to accomplish, and it became the greatest survival story in exploration history. That's the paradox of Shackleton. His greatest failure was his greatest success. He never crossed Antarctica, but he brought everyone home, and in the end, that mattered more than any geographical achievement ever could. Men wanted for hazardous journey. Low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness. Safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in event of success. This advertisement, supposedly placed by Shackleton for the Endurance expedition, though its authenticity is disputed, captures the spirit of polar exploration. Men knew the risks, they came anyway. And because Ernest Shackleton was their leader, they all came home.